to represent all of our production in physical representations of some precious metal, whatever they may be. And present history perfectly proves this fact. Ron Paul and G. Edward Griffin and Austrian economists and Ron Paul's supporters are constantly claiming, that gold has resulted in stability, which of course is a lie that's been perpetrated by Ron Paul. Well, what happens if we look at the history of gold in the United States, for instance? Well, the value of gold was regulated. So if you just looked at a chart of the value of gold in dollars, it stayed the same all the time that it was regulated. Then things got so far out of whack that they had to change the amount to which it was regulated. Imagine that. Perfect stability? Absolutely not. Then they changed it again. And finally, when they were forced to abandon the gold standard, not because of a fractional reserve system, but because they had to adopt a fractional reserve system if they were going to provide a circulation which would sustain vast industrial increases in production above what had been sustained before on when in fact were greater gold holdings earlier in our history. We have less in the U.S. Treasury now than we had at the beginning of the Great Depression. So when you look at this, what you find is, you can just look at the chart as a simpleton and say, well, the gold is equal forever and ever and ever, it seems like, until you get to one of these junctures where they change the value of gold. All right? But even across, if the only time that it existed was that one span of time, that the value of gold was the exact same amount all through that time because it was fixed to the dollar by law. Does that mean that gold held the same value? Absolutely not, because a further thing is going on here. When you restrict the circulation to a finite quantity, that finite quantity is forced itself to compete for far greater industrial production, which means prices aren't driven down to our necessary advantage because that drives down income, you see, not just costs, but income or potential income, and yet prior commitments exist, debts, promissory obligations which need to be fulfilled. And you're never going to stop people from issuing promissory obligations, but by denying them any possibility of justice whatsoever. I mean, promissory obligations are intrinsic to all kinds of interaction between economic entities, enterprise. So, nonetheless, if we examine the purportedly consistent value of gold across some time span where its value has been regulated by law to be so many dollars, nonetheless, the value of a dollar is changing all that time. It cannot be prevented because the volume of industrial production has changed. And this is why, these people are just, they're fools to merely claim that because even the price of gold was fixed in dollars, that the value of gold wasn't vacillating all the while just the same, because likewise, as a currency, it was competing. It was competing for industrial production, which grew and grew and grew far, far faster than we accumulated gold. The proportions do matter. G. Edward Griffin dismisses my argument. He claims it's childish in his book, that the proportions don't matter, and that's his final argument. He just states that the proportions don't matter. Now you tell me how they don't matter. You can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't claim inflation is destroying the dollar or an increase in circulation, which doesn't even exist. But you can't claim that is the cause of devaluating the dollar and at the same time just claim that the proportions don't matter. That would be the same as an employer saying, well, I just don't feel like giving you the money that I committed to giving you as your salary. I'm going to give you a tiny fraction of it instead. The proportions don't matter. They do matter. They absolutely matter. And the real issue here is whether or not we can acquire representations of our own production that therefore remain as evidence that we can acquire the productions of others equal to our own production, which is our object, which, going back to the debates then, is the object that all these phonies are preventing us from achieving, because they won't even discuss the obfuscation of the currency, which is the fundamental problem at the bottom of it. Now, in the debates, Governor Perry, asserted that Social Security is a Ponzi scheme. And the analysts, so-called analysts, the disinformation specialists, jumped all over this as if, Perry had made some outlandish claim. And then they went on to assert that the American people wants a Social Security as it is. Well, that's absolutely not true. And we know that particularly from our youngest generation's point of view, because it won't be even possible for them to sustain themselves because of the unsustainability that's built into the basic pattern of Social Security. When it began, the people who are receiving benefits from it now hardly put anything in at all. They had many children who paying into it, of course, provided to sustain the parent generation to far greater prosperity is possible than if that system is funded by the children of the next generation, funding that parent generation if that parent generation has far fewer children. It's not sustainable. What's more, it's been gutted. It's been gutted by violation of principle. That is, while that money was taken for the retirement years of my generation, for instance, nonetheless, the funds were robbed by the Clinton administration to use for other purposes. Now, this has created what they called near-term unfunded federal liabilities, which is a bunch of mumbo jumbo intended to disguise the fact that they assumed a further debt to the American people, which they're actually going to get from the American people to pay the American people with interest. So all of this is crimes against us, and Perry was right. He was wrong in resorting to a simple assertion that it's a Ponzi scheme. It's not really a Ponzi scheme. It's not even voluntary. Worse than a Ponzi scheme even, the funds aren't even dedicated to what they're supposed to be dedicated to. So this again is solved by mathematically perfected economy, because we would decide, if we decide to do so, to have an alternate system where, because we're preserving the value of money, we might just compel savings which remain in the possession of the person. The federal government, nor any other government, can touch our savings, unless, of course, we commit some kind of offense which, we might need to rely on those funds to protect the rest of society from loss due to criminal activity by a person, which is a possible thing to do under mathematically perfected economy to protect the integrity of the currency. It's not mandatory. It's not part of mathematically perfected economy itself. It would be a means of enforcement. For instance, a person buys a brand new home, decides they're an anarchist, and vandalizes the home and then disappears from the country. Well, under mathematically perfected economy, if you're forcing people to save for retirement, there'd be substantial funds to recoup losses, to reverse the vandalism, and so on and so forth. And this would be a possible way of protecting society against people who abuse the system, truly abuse the system. I'm not talking about purported tax dodgers or something like that, where people, you see, we have to understand how many ways these crimes have been perpetrated against us. And this is another thing that came up in the GOP debates, about raising taxes. What's happened here, because federal debt since Reagan was in office has been accumulated beyond any hope of even paying it down. And because we're not servicing that debt, it's accumulating. And because we need to accumulate this debt, not that we need to accumulate the debt part of it, but that we need to acquire the funds to spend them into circulation to sustain a circulation of all the principal and interest we're paying out of circulation in suffering a terminal sum of falsified indebtedness, which is imposed upon the private sector. Being as this federal overspending is the only way that's replenishing the circulation of what we're paying out of it, we're forced to persist in a crime against ourselves. But the solution for this, and justice itself, is not to enforce this payment of these falsified debts upon the people, particularly by increasing taxes and purported federal austerity. No, the issue is to resolve the debts to what they ought to be, which is to count all prior payments of interest instead toward principal, which resolves most of the debts. We don't need to increase taxes to fix the system. We need to reduce them. So this brings us back, again, that statement brings us back to Obama's purported job stimulus package, which he announced Thursday before Congress in a congressional address. Now he's proposing to spend $450 billion into circulation. Lo and behold, assuming further federal debt, that is, debt of the people on behalf of the federal government, right? And which debt, of course, will be funded in the usual manner by the Federal Reserve, printing up evidence of our promissory obligation, which we haven't even given our assent to, and subjecting it, of course, to interest. Well, the problem here is, again, that what are we doing? Now, the Republicans were actually discussing increasing taxes if need be. It's the only right thing. Oh, we're not supporting our troops if we don't pay more taxes, Romney was saying. But my God, people, that's such a preposterous lie. It isn't about not supporting your troops. It's about whether or not, the question is whether or not the troops who got a tiny fraction of all this obfuscated currency, whether or not that cost should be funded in the way that it is, which perpetually multiplies a sum of debt upon the people who are not supporting their troops. They're supporting their troops many times over to a mere faux creditor who merely publishes evidence of our unassented promissory obligation to the Federal Reserve banks. You see, so the federal government then becomes the police agent and enforcer of this ever increasing sum of stealing, which is diverted to the central banks. So all in all, this is what's